Good morning, everyone. My name is Jo Bogner. I'm with the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute, and I'm so glad you're joining us this morning for this important topic called The Coming Retirement Tsunami, Why Transit Agencies and the Public Sector Can No Longer Ignore Succession Planning. I'm really excited to have two dynamic speakers this morning. Del Peterson is with the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute's Small Urban and Rural Transit Center. Del joined the organization in 2003, and he has conducted research pertaining to the transit vehicle industry, small urban sprawl, intelligent transportation systems deployment, and issues related to passenger mobility enhancements, etc. He holds a bachelor's degree in management and economics and a master's degree in agribusiness and applied economics. Del has conducted some research which I think you're going to find very interesting. He'll be talking about that momentarily, and it's really related to what transit agencies are doing with regard to workforce development and specifically succession planning. After Del's presentation, we have Patrick Ibarra. Patrick Ibarra is the founder and managing partner of the Mejorando group, and Mejorando is a Spanish word which means getting better all the time. Patrick is an entrepreneur of ideas and an architect of innovation, and he seeks to challenge the status quo thinking, which I think is pretty prevalent in the public sector, that we've always done it this way, and to replace that kind of thinking with a progressive approach to continuous improvement. So Patrick today is going to share his experience as a former city manager and human resource director. He's also worked with numerous Fortune 500 companies and governmental agencies across the country, and he's going to explain an approach today which I think you'll find very helpful in terms of specific things that you can do to address succession planning. I want to remind the participants today that only the presenters can project audio. So if you wish to ask a question, and we do certainly invite you to do that, please use the audio box and type your question into the box, and then Del and Patrick will answer those questions either during their presentation or after their presentation. So please feel free to ask questions. And so with that, without further ado, Del, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Jo. I'm happy to be here today. I'm talking about some previous research, actually ongoing research that we're completing here at North Dakota State University. And before I start, just a little bit more about myself. I guess I'm kind of the poster boy for rural America, if you will. I grew up on a family farm in northwest Minnesota, and the topic today, obviously what I'm going to be talking about anyway, is from a real rural perspective, and I guess I have a pretty good understanding about rural America and how it works, and I've been working with research and development issues throughout the past 13 plus years now related to this part of the country. So this is a specific study, as I mentioned, we did or the survey specifically over the past few months, and I'm going to get a little bit into that. Our survey design and administration, what we put together. Originally this was supposed to be, the study itself was, we were going to look at the North Dakota, Minnesota, and South Dakota, the three-state area, and then we decided, well, let's take this national. This is really an issue when we talk about workforce development, succession planning, these kind of issues. This is something that really I think would be useful for the whole country, obviously, and from a rural perspective to take a look at. So we administered this online. Obviously, paper surveys and things are very hard to administer anyway, and to do that at a national level is very intimidating and difficult and costly. So online would seem like the best method to use. We focus this on transit agency managers and directors. So we're looking at the high ends of the agencies, those that are in charge, calling the shots, if you will. And the questionnaire itself was 22 main questions. We also had some sub-questions based on previous questions. If you choose yes, if you choose this answer, please elaborate and let us know more detail about these issues. We had a 5311 email list that we used through the 5311 program. We had 700 or so active email addresses that we targeted with the online survey. For those of you who aren't familiar with the 5311 formula grant and program, I should probably explain that a little bit. 5311 is a formula federal program, and it is distributed to the states for the purpose, through the U.S. DOT, the purpose of supporting populations in areas that are 50,000 population or smaller. And it has a number of goals, of course, but a couple of the main ones and related to this specific research is to enhance the access of people in non-urbanized areas and their access to everyday services, and also to assist and maintain non-urbanized public transportation systems. And so specifically today talking about those systems as a whole. From that list, we did receive 137 surveys, as you see here, and we had almost a 20% response rate. And we also received 23 other surveys throughout the country that were viable. And I say viable, we had a number of others that also came in that were partially completed and other issues as well. But so we ended up with a total of 160 viable surveys, and we had no incentive. I would like to mention that for completing these surveys as well. We do a lot of work with university students and different organizations, and we usually do provide some kind of incentive to complete a questionnaire or a survey, whether it be a gift card or putting that name in a drawing for some type of award. And for this one we didn't. So we thought getting the 20% response rate and other surveys as well was really we were happy with that. We thought that was a good distribution. And the distribution, obviously, when you do a nationwide survey, as a researcher, from my point of view, you always get a little nervous. You call it a nationwide study, and sometimes you get maybe responses from 10 or 15 states, and then obviously you have that question, is it a nationwide study if we only hear from 20% of the states or different things? But unfortunately with this, we received responses from 40 different states, so 80% of the states in the country responded. And we received, a nice distribution as well across the country. The white states you see here on the map, we did not receive any responses from, but the light blue we received between 1 to 4 responses, and then 5 or more from the remaining states in the sample. And you see a lot, obviously, here in the upper Midwest. I'm in Fargo, North Dakota State University, which is right on the border of North Dakota and Minnesota. And but we did receive many responses from California and many from out in Ohio. We received some from the Southeast, Northeast, and Texas as well. So really a little bit of everything, which was good to see, and really, added to that national study focus that we wanted to focus on. So digging into the survey a little bit, talking about the participants, some of the respondents, and just, simple slide here on age. And this was from, once again, the transit manager and CEO level. So we expected it not to be a bunch of 20 and 30 somethings, obviously, as to get to be a manager or top level in an agency is something you usually grow into and need a lot of experience within the organization and others. And just looking here, you see 75% of the respondents were age 50 or greater that completed the questionnaire. Next here we have employment length. This was just a general question asking how long have you been employed at your current transit agency? And you see here this is really, in a day and age when a lot of employees are really jumping around every 2, 3, 5 years, they'll switch organizations, switch jobs, job functions. You see here that the vast majority had been or are in this with their current agency for 11 years plus, so really a long time, and really have gotten to know the organization and the intricacies and the day-to-day operations that are involved with it. So it's always good to see. And then we also asked about time at current position. So how long have you been the manager? How long have you been the CEO? How long have you been the acting director of your agency? And this was really interesting. I thought that we had a number, almost 30%, that had been on the job at their current position for less than 5 years, fewer than 5 years. And then we had also a great number that have been there, 11, 15, 20 years plus. So really a nice cross-section of people who have become managers recently and people that have been managers for decades. So it was really nice to see that and get a wide range of opinions then based on different experience levels as well. And then positions held within agencies. This was, I thought, a little surprising. The majority said that the only position they had ever held in the current agency was that current position of manager or director, whereas in a lot of transit agencies that I've seen and worked with, people kind of move up through the ranks. They start maybe as mid-level management, lower level, and kind of work their way up. So they've held 2 or 3 or 4 different positions. But with this survey anyway, most of them, this was their current and only position that they had held. This obviously now getting into retirement. This is a hypothetical question we asked about how long do you see yourself working before you retire and leave the labor force and leave this current transit agency that you're with. And, when we talk about workforce development, this is obviously, a huge issue. And you see here, which I guess was kind of expected, that when you kind of added up at least the 10 years or less left in the workforce area, you're talking probably 60% of respondents indicated that they plan on retiring within the next 10 years, and about 30% within just the next 5 years. So, hypothetically, if we were going to have this same questionnaire and send it out 10 years from now, 60% of the respondents would no longer even be in the workforce. They would be fully retired. So we're talking a huge turnover within the next 5 to 10 years. And then employees, we dug a little deeper to trying to get some more information about the agencies themselves, how many employees are involved, and we were looking here specifically at part-time and full-time employees. We did not want to include contract workers. A lot of rural transit agencies do contract out specifically for their maintenance on their buses, a lot of their accounting, bookkeeping things. But we did not want to include those employees. We wanted to include the full and part-time employees within the agency. And here you see, this varied widely from just a handful of employees at some agencies to, more than 30, and some were upwards of 40, 50, 60 employees that were either full or part-time. So then trainings. We talked in this section and really wanted to know, what do managers believe is available? So we asked them, what trainings are you familiar with that are available for you to take to really improve your skills and management levels? And you have a number here, and these were kind of the big ones that I highlight here. You see on the bottom, 36% said they are familiar with public transit principles, which is a course offered that really deals with the nuts and bolts and day-to-day operations of transit management and how it all fits together and works. And then you have others that they were aware of as well, from emergency management to human resource management, and then working with local governments, which is obviously very important for all, and cost-benefit analysis, which can be very helpful as well. This was a little surprising, I thought anyway, from my point of view. We asked, how many trainings have you actually attended within the last 5 years? And no was actually the majority. That 54% indicated they had not attended any type of training over the last 5-year time frame, and with just less than half then indicating they had, which we thought was quite surprising in a 5-year time frame to not attend any training whatsoever. But then kind of on the flip side, of those who had attended a training, over 90% indicated that it was beneficial. The training they attended, or trainings they attended, were beneficial to their job and really helped them with the day-to-day operations and working and growing as an employee in their organization. So we thought, so then, when you think of these two slides, you have the majority not taking any training, but the trainings that people take they're really happy with and feel are beneficial. So then the next question kind of leads into, well, why are you not taking trainings? What is preventing you from taking more training? So we asked the question then, what are the reasons for not taking trainings that are available to you and your agency? And we received a multitude of answers, of course. I think the main focus here, and you see this in rural America all over, it was kind of the bottom two, they both came back at 47%. This was a check all that apply question. And then the two big things that came back were not enough time and not enough funding available. And that's really true, and you hear that time and time again. And the time thing is huge. Many transit managers, if you're dealing with an agency with maybe 10, 15, 20 employees, if a driver calls in sick or somebody else, that manager might be required to actually get on the bus and drive it themselves if they're qualified, or do something else, really wear a lot of hats within the organization. So time is of the essence. We received only 12% of people indicated that trainings are not too time consuming. So that was always concern. If you have maybe a 1 or 2 or 3 day training, is it too time consuming? And the respondents indicated that really no, that wasn't a concern of theirs. And then you see the top one here, distance to training sites, was definitely an issue. And we talked again about rural America. You could be talking to go to an actual training site, maybe 100, 200, 300 miles in one direction, in order to receive sufficient training. Web-based was also one thing that we talked about, and was another question asking if respondents had done any type of web-based training, and most indicated that they had, and that was successful as well. So that's definitely, and a forum like this with a webinar, this kind of disseminating of information was also important with most transit managers. We then asked, digging more into the kind of the workforce development succession planning kind of issue, mid-level managers, this is from the transit manager perspective again, but if they were to look at their mid-level managers and those that would be interested in maybe being promoted, maybe becoming the head manager, director someday of the agency, what trainings specifically do they believe would be necessary for employees within their organization to be promoted and, really move up the ladder, if, so to speak. And transit principles, then again, at about 50%, which again deals with really the basics and day-to-day operations, so that would be very beneficial. And then other things such as emergency management, human resources. I mean, it's all there on the chart. But I think it's interesting to see really the range and the different skill sets that are really necessary to succeed and be a successful manager. This was a little interesting, maybe even a little troubling. We asked agencies if they have any type of reward recognition program for their employees, and found it surprising that only 40%, or even a little less than 40%, indicated that they do not have any current, or they do have a current recognition program, and 60%, over 60%, said that they do not have any type of recognition program currently in place for their employees. And then, based on that, we asked of those that do have some type of recognition program, what do you do? And what do you do to recognize your employees for, outstanding work? And certificates were the number one with 80% of respondents indicating that certificates were available, and other things from plaques to recognition letters to lunches and dinners. And, I think I'd really, I've dealt with a lot of transit agencies, and I think these recognition programs are very important, really, for the agency to improve employee morale and improve them, to really strive and work hard to make the organization as good as it can be. And I would recommend anybody that doesn't currently have some type of recognition program really to get something off the ground. And it doesn't have to be anything really costly or time-consuming. I mean, something as simple as certificates to employees that do an outstanding job. It seems to be very successful when it comes to employee morale and the workforce as a whole, really improving that. And then finally, we talked a lot about and really wanted to focus on succession planning. And it was a little concerning here, as you see, that only 15% of respondents to this survey indicated that they have some type of formal, or well, not formal even, some type of succession plan at all that's available or is being used within the organization. And within those that indicated they do have some type of a plan in place, they mentioned, a few mentioned written procedures that they do have in place. Some said they have staff that are designated to work closely and familiarize new management and personnel with rules and processes. And then a few also said that they use goal setting, they had monthly reporting, they had boards, human resource committees, and then a few mentioned job shadowing and mentoring programs that they have within the organization as a form of succession planning and getting employees ready to take that next step into more management, more different roles of within the organization. So that was a little startling, I guess, from our point of view. But then quickly, just to mention, get back and look at the highlights and kind of what we found. We had a nice cross-section, as I mentioned, of responses from 40 different states throughout the country. We saw that 75% of these were age 50 plus, so just really highlighting the turnover that's going to happen within the next 5, 10, 15 years. We found the majority have been employed a long time compared to the workforce as a whole, the current agency 15 or more years. And then of those, the 50 plus, 1/3 do plan to retire within the next 5-year time frame. And that's, of course, a plan, which obviously can change, but that is from their perspective at this point in time. And then again, highlighting that only 40% of respondents said they have some type of recognition program for their current workforce. And also then getting back to succession planning, the 15% had any type of succession plan or what they would consider defined as a succession plan in place. And details of these plans varied considerably from agency to agency. So with that, this is my contact information here at North Dakota State University, and this is also just one part of a much larger study that will be completed and available on our website at SURTC.org within the next month or two. And that'll include a literature review. It'll include a lot of resources for rural transit agencies that are interested in training, and these sorts of things, from rural to local to state level and up to national agencies that deal with training for these smaller organizations. So with that, I'll say thank you for your time, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Del. That was very interesting, and I think that really underscores, the title of this webinar, The Coming Retirement Tsunami, and your research really supports the fact that agencies, public agencies of all kinds, really have to get serious about succession planning. So if there are no other questions for Del, we'll give it a minute or so for any questions to come in, but we'll then spool up for Patrick to give his presentation. There were a couple of questions that came in earlier asking whether the slides will be available after the webinar, and they will be made available for download, and we will provide a link after the webinar is completed today. So I do not see any questions coming in. With that, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Del, for the wonderful introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to learn a little bit more about succession planning. And my approach this morning is to talk about the concept and the application. I'm going to share some statistical information, slightly different than what Del shared with you. We also have some polling questions we're going to be asking, so kind of stay tuned and close to your computer, if you will, because we're going to ask you some questions just to get a sense of who's on the webinar, but also just some of the challenges you may be having. So here we go. And that's a picture of me. Don't I look wonderful? As Joe mentioned I'd love to be photoshopped before I leave the house. As Joe mentioned in my bio, I'm a former city manager. I spent 15 years in city government. I'm also a recovering HR director. And in 2002 started my firm, the Mejorando Group. And we're based outside of Phoenix and Glendale, Arizona. We have clients nationwide, including in North and South Dakota and up the Upper Plains, the Great Northwest, the West, all over the country. And I've worked in this area of succession planning for over a decade. We've been in business since 2002. But as many of you may recall, in about 2005-06, pre-recession, that's really when the talk started around what are, this whole topic of succession planning. What does that mean? How does that impact public sector agencies? Pardon me. And then the recession hit, and it sort of put this item on the back burner. Now it's coming back in a way more prevalent, and in some respects more challenging. What I want to hope to try to do today for you is provide you some tools, techniques, and tips about how to go back and instantly and immediately start to implement it. Because what I gather, and I've worked with a lot of agencies on succession planning, helping them design and implement programs for their organizations, is for years people have talked about it. What I find is people seem to, so that's where it stops. They talk about it, they think about it, they talk about thinking about it, and they're not sure what to do. And I'm hoping today to provide you those next steps to get you moving. Let me share with you some statistical information, a couple of slides here. And a little bit, this is a year or two old, but I think it's still relevant. Only 13% of local government managers are under 40, while nearly 71% were under 40 in the early 1970s. I'm sure you're seeing a shift and possibly maybe even a collision of generations. We're hearing a lot more talk about millennials. Millennials are essentially people under 35 in the workplace, but the workforce is getting younger and older simultaneously. It's sort of interesting about how that's occurring. The second bullet point is each day 10,000 people turn 65, and for the first time now, millennials outnumber boomers in the workplace, 76 million to 75, and they comprise a third of the current workforce at 53 million. And by 2025, they'll make up 75% of the workforce. So again, we know these trends are happening. It's not something we can stop. It does start to create different expectations, different demands, I think different challenges in organizations. How millennials want to learn and grow is somewhat different than how a lot of boomers and Gen Yers want to learn and grow. They look at their careers differently. I'll share a little bit of that with you as we get into that. These millennials are creating some disruption in the organization just because of their attitudes and behaviors about how they see themselves. And just in short, that younger people, millennials often see themselves as knowledge-free agents who are going to lease their talents for as long as they're challenged, and when they're bored, they're gone. So they don't define loyalty as seniority, and I know that drives, and I'm a boomer myself, and I know a lot of boomers, they get frustrated because they think young people aren't loyal because they're not there a long time. But that also is one of the myths about succession planning, which is seniority translates to competence, which I think many of us on this webinar would contest that that's not always true. By the way, another myth about succession planning is that it's not about pre-selection. So when we get into succession planning, keep in mind, in the forefront of your mind, that succession planning is a process, not an event. So it's not about putting simply a new organization chart together for 2017 or 2018 and plugging in names. It's really how do you equip your workforce so they're going to be competitive when openings happen. So it's not about a guarantee, and it's not about pre-selection. It's really trying to make sure that you're building your workforce. And my question, and I write for Governing and ICMA and a variety of organizations, and I recently wrote a piece, and my final statement in that article was, what if you don't develop your workforce and they stay? And so something to ponder, just to think about. The average age of a local government employee is 44 compared to the average age of a private sector employee, which is 39. And then moving on, in 2014, 19% of the government workforce reached age 61, which is the average retirement age, and by 2018, this figure rises to 28% of those working. We're going to get into a little bit what I recommend in regards to looking at your workforce statistically, and I'll share with you some approaches about how to do that so you can get past the anecdotal evidence that you sort of everybody knows in your organization that think people are getting older, but how do you really start to pare that down and look at it through a different lens? And I'm going to provide that for you today, for this morning. Second bullet point there is 49% of local governments reported higher levels of retirement in 2013 compared with 2012. I've not seen newer information since then, but what was fascinating during the recession is, you know, there was a lot of talk about retirements, and in fact, during the recession, people in public sector retirement systems actually, there was an increase, an uptick nationwide, and I don't think that was simply demographic. What I've gathered from talking with people is many people bought their last year or two, they accelerated their retirement, as I show there on the final bullet point, because they wanted to get in and grandfathered in because they knew pension reform was on its way. So the public sector was the anomaly during the recession in regards to retirement. The challenge was, as many of those people left, public sector agencies didn't necessarily have the budget opportunities to replace those people. And I'm sure many of those of you on this webinar had those challenges. People were leaving, but you may have used that vacancy as a cost saving, so you weren't able to fill those positions. Hopefully your budgets are starting to get a little healthier. Now you're looking at how do you build the workforce. But anyway, these are some statistics, and just Monday of this week, the State and Local Government, Center for State and Local Government released their survey of HR managers throughout state and local government regarding what are the most pressing trends. Won't come as any surprise, I think, to people on this webinar, but 92% of those respondents indicated that the top challenge in the organization was recruitment and retention, and we'll cover that as well. The second leading vote getter, if you will, 80% said succession planning is still a pressing need in their organization, and the third leading vote getter was 79%, which is staff development. So again, it's all about the people-centric issues, and I don't think that's simply coming from, just because it's HR people that were surveyed. I think they're representing primarily an organization-wide perspective about how to build their workforce. So what is succession planning? Here's a textbook definition, if you will. It ensures the continued effective performance of your organization by establishing a process to identify, select, and manage talent to build bench strength. So a question I have for you is, when you think about your bench strength in your organization, how do you feel? And I'm assuming that many of you are on this webinar because you don't feel as good as you'd like. You don't feel as strong as you'd like to, because maybe your bench isn't as well prepared as you think. And so what succession planning is trying to do, think of this in short, here's a really brief definition. It's trying to wed resources, your agency's resources for learning and development and growth, with people's initiative. One of the things about succession planning is it's not for everybody, and it's not simply about getting promoted. You have people in your agency, good people, salt of the earth people, rock solid, doing tough, demanding work every day. So they think succession planning is not for them because they don't necessarily want to get promoted. And that's cool. Not everybody wants to get promoted. However, I would offer to you that when you look at building your workforce, Succession planning is one tool, but how do you make sure that incumbents stay fully qualified? Because nothing is more tragic than when an employee leaves an organization and they're not qualified to get the job they just left. So I really encourage you to think about, as you're building your workforce, how do you keep people qualified in their own position, technical skills, people skills, and then how are you building the workforce so you make sure that you have people competitive when openings happen. And I know there are some people on this webinar from smaller agencies. You may have to go outside and buy talent. I mean, you don't always have natural successors in your organization. Sometimes what I find with clients, there's kind of a bifurcation. There's people in the management roles, and then you have people in administrative roles. And so you don't always have people in those administrative roles that are interested or maybe capable of moving up to those management roles. So you have to think about building your workforce not simply from within, but also possibly in how you're hiring. We're going to cover that as well. Notice in this definition, I identify to identify, select, and manage, not simply just to promote. So think of this more holistically in how you're building your workforce internally and externally. Okay. So that's just a textbook definition. And then as we look at, here's a polling slide, and Chris is going to help me run this polling slide. So Chris, if you can step in and maybe explain. You see, would ask you, how satisfied are you with your current succession planning efforts? There's three options: very satisfied, somewhat, dissatisfied. That dissatisfied is gathering steam. Somewhat satisfied. We'll give it another 10 seconds or so to give people a chance. We have about 65 to 70 people on this call, by the way. Okay. Chris, we want to close the polling slide. Does everybody see that there was about 50% that were somewhat dissatisfied, about 45% somewhat dissatisfied, and 45% dissatisfied. So again, another reason probably why you're on this webinar is because you're trying to get on the other side of this. And we're going to have 4 or 5 of these polling slides just to give a sense of all of you that you're probably in good company of others on this webinar. So the reasons for succession planning, we've got to be careful not to make the assumption. What I have found is that people think that, especially just people throughout organizations, believe that, well, of course this is important. Well, when you look at your organization, there's always priorities that are more demanding, whether it's funding or operations or services or equipment or fleet replacement or dealing with elected officials or, all those things. And those things never go away, and I can appreciate those. They're always front and center, demanding your time and attention. So what I would offer to you is, when you really stop and think, how do you make succession planning compelling to the workforce as well as to maybe your governing body? One of the areas that I would suggest in dealing with elected officials is, one of the things that the area in particular is, consider succession planning as a risk management strategy. And I don't mean risk management in liability and casualty in that sense, but risk management in the sense that unless you have qualified, capable, mission-oriented employees in your organization delivering services, providing services and programs to your customers, you're not relevant as a service provider. What succession planning does, it allows you to, for continuity of operations, it allows you to make sure that you're having that steady supply of qualified, capable, mission-oriented people in the positions in order to deliver services and programs on a daily basis. I think when you frame it to your elected officials and maybe even to your senior managers that this is a risk management strategy, I think that gets their attention more than that this is simply an HR issue. And as a recovering HR director, sometimes HR initiatives don't always gather enough traction in the organization. And I would offer to you, and I'll get into this a little bit later on this morning, but if succession planning is perceived simply as an HR issue, I think it's going to struggle for attention, validity, and success in the organization. This has to be viewed as an organization-wide issue, and it's going to need organization-wide horsepower from people within the organization to make sure that it's adopted, implemented, and that it's effective. So here are just some basic reasons, as I just shared with you. The first bullet point, continuity of operations. Again, it's not necessarily equipment that provides services. It's not technology. It's not buildings. It's qualified, capable, mission-driven employees that are able to deliver your services. Another reason is to identify a highly talented individual. Probably one of the most delicate aspects in succession planning in the public sector is starting to segregate people who are highly talented against people who aren't. And I know, and I can empathize, that's really sensitive, because what that implies is having conversations with employees that aren't necessarily part of your future. And I can appreciate whether you're in a union environment or a non-union environment, those can be delicate. That can be a delicate dance. However, this is critical to making sure succession planning works. Is segmenting your workforce around those people who have initiative and desire to want to grow and learn, even to stay fully qualified, and those that don't. And so you want to make sure, and I'll get into this too, you want to make sure that whatever succession planning opportunities you have, and I'll provide you a laundry list here a little bit later, make sure that it's not mandatory, because I think that when it's mandatory, when people are in the room, because it's either mandatory or they're voluntold to be here, you don't want people just to sign up and show up. You want people to sign up and step up. And so keep that in mind as you look at your workforce. And as I say, sort of tongue-in-cheek, there are two types of employees. There's climbers and there's coasters. Another two types is there's thoroughbreds and there's mules. And then finally, another two types. There are employees we have a party for before they leave. Try not to laugh too much. And then there are those employees we have a party for after they leave. So my point to this is, succession planning is to build your workforce, but it's not, one size fits all, that everybody's going to be interested, that everybody's going to be agreeable to it. You're trying to make sure and wed resources that your organization provide with people's initiative and energy that want to grow and learn and be part of your organization. A third bullet point here is it promotes employee development. Their learning and growth. Think of the trajectory of their own learning and growth. You all have, I'm sure, you have bookcases full of plans, operations plans, funding plans, capital plans, fleet replacement plans, service plans, maybe even public outreach plans. Think of succession planning as an organizational people plan. Because I would venture to say rarely have I seen in public sector agencies where they have a people plan. And I don't mean to sound, like that's kind of silly, but when you think about all those plans you have, what's critical to their effective implementation is having people in place that are qualified and committed to executing that. None of those plans happen just by themselves. And also, here's another term you may want to become acquainted with, is the talent pool. And what I mean by that is you're trying to have more than enough people qualified. And I will make a guarantee to you, and it's always a little risky for consultants to make guarantees, but I'm going to make a guarantee. And I've seen this with my clients, that when you do succession planning well, the challenge you will have is you'll have more qualified people than you know what to do with. And isn't that a good problem to have? Now, I know that creates the idea, well, that means some people may leave. You're right. In some of your organizations, some people may leave because they need to go to maybe a larger organization to get different experience, or maybe they need to go to a smaller organization to have a broader span of control. I look at that and say, and I know no one wants to sort of see good, talented people leave. However, that's the downside of building up your workforce. The upside is, think of what those people that are in that talent pool are doing while they're in your organization. They're learning, they're growing, they're applying, they're executing, they're performing well. Does that mean sometimes people are going to leave your organization? Yes, but again, the question is, what if you don't develop people and they stay? Because talented people always have options regardless of the economy. So again, keep that in mind, that you're trying to build a pool of talent, not simply just, pre-selecting the one person. Here's the process, and I'll get into this in more detail here momentarily. You're trying to identify potential. And remember, and this is kind of a tricky notion here, because someone is simply a high performer does not necessarily mean they have high potential. Some people hit their ceiling soon in their career. Other people, and I know this is somewhat subjective in your assessment of your workforce, but you're trying to identify people that have a higher ceiling in their learning and growth, not simply because of their desire, but that you see that they still have, they're still unpacking. They're still growing and learning. The second process is you're trying to assess people's readiness via performance and assessments. I know this is kind of problematic in most organizations I've come across, but the performance appraisal process is important in succession planning. I know for many of you probably on this webinar, performance appraisal may be just something you'd like to just skip over once a year, and I'm sure many of you aren't calling up HR and saying, can we do it more often and can we get a longer form? That's not been my experience that people are doing that. The challenge is when people, your employees, are not receiving timely, relevant feedback on their capabilities, they really don't have a good gauge about what they need to do to learn and grow, and that's not a good thing. Number one, their self-awareness is not there. Number two, they're not really sure what it is they need to learn and grow. So three, when you're trying to equip them with new skills and capabilities, they're not really sure how they connect to their current capabilities. So I'm not saying that you need to have a perfect performance appraisal process, because I don't even think that exists. However, you do need to have a credible, worthwhile performance appraisal process. The third bullet point as part of the process of succession planning is you're really trying to determine, and in some respects, determine the strategies and close those strategies, or close those gaps between the workforce that you have and the workforce that you need. So when you look at succession planning, I encourage you to think about what's on the horizon in the next several years. And I work with a lot of organizations doing strategic planning, and it's not so much to adopt a four-color document for the 2020 plan, or it's all pretty and laminated. It's really trying to look at the next 12 to 24 to 36 months. And when I work with clients, I don't call it a retreat. I call it an advance, because it's more important about where you're going than where you've been. And that strategic planning is, in some respects, a component of succession planning, because as you look at your organization and you say, what are the challenges? What are the trends? Fiscal trends, transit trends, transportation, the quality of life trends that maybe you're impacted by, the urban or rural trends regarding housing and how that's shifting, and what impact does that have on transit and how people use it, the funding, new federal laws, new state requirements. I mean, you all live in that world where you're in that vortex of dealing with trends and change, and some of those are disruptive and nonlinear. When you think about it, trying to get on the other side, at least in craft, what do those trends mean to how we build our workforce and deliver services? That's critical. And even in a micro, and to that third bullet point, the micro aspect of that is, how are you equipping your workforce in particular to deal with these shifting trends, and how you deliver services and provide programs to your customers? The fourth bullet point is to provide opportunities for employees to pursue career paths and express career interests. What we're finding as well going on now, especially younger people, they don't see themselves, and I'm sure that some people on this webinar, you don't necessarily have clear career ladders in your organization. And that's challenging, because people are going, where do I go from here? And being a transit operator 2, no one's laying awake at night and say, I can't wait to be a transit operator 3. That's a classification level, maybe even a pay level. It's not necessarily a career step. So when you look at career paths, think of career lattice instead of a career ladder. Consider it more of as a jungle gym than a step-by-step process. Often millennials see themselves as a portfolio of skills, not a job title. So they're very comfortable maneuvering through different job functions and not necessarily landing out step by step, that I go from here and then I go from that step to the next step. So part of what succession planning is, and this along with mentoring are probably the two fastest growing segments I see with clients, that they're investing more time and attention to provide for employees, is career services, again, not a career path, advisory services, if you will, as well as mentoring. Well, now here are the three types of succession planning, and there's a good chance that many of you have been doing the first one at the top there. Simple replacement planning. You looked at your org chart. You looked at what people were potentially retiring in the next few years. You started building, made the workforce, maybe even worst kept secret in the organization, creating the heir apparent of who would replace that person. Somebody left, you replaced them with somebody. That worked for a long time in the workforce, because boomers dominated they were the dominant demographic. People didn't leave very much. And so you could do your org chart in some respects in ink. Now you have to do it in pencil, because the people that are the heir apparent, sometimes they're a year or two younger than the person leaving, so they're leaving right behind them. So simple replacement planning is probably not going to work for you in the near or long-term future. The other thing I want to make sure to stress about succession planning is that people don't leave organizations simply for retirement. That's another myth around succession planning, that it's simply just to deal with retirement. And while the title of this webinar today is about dealing with retirement tsunami, and absolutely the silver tsunami is happening, I think it's also important, as you look at your workforce, to recognize that people leave for lifestyle reasons. Somebody in their family gets sick, they got to move. A parent gets sick, they got to move to another part of the country. Their spouse gets relocated. Life happens. So please keep in mind that building your workforce is not simply to deal with people who retire, and I'll share a little bit of that with you as we look at your workforce. The second and third types of succession planning are what we're going to really get into this morning, and that is the developmental, which is how you're growing your workforce, and the third is that talent pool. So we'll get into that here as we get into the 5-phase process. And moving on. And again, please feel free to ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them in real time. One of the first step that I encourage organizations to do as they start succession planning is, and I've done this for a number of clients, is we evaluate their current practices. Essentially, we assess what they're doing now as a baseline. The opportunity as you go forward is, and I know the tendency is, let's go do this, let's go put this solution, let's put that solution in place. I'm obviously a huge fan. I mean, I'm a solution provider to clients. The question is, what's the current state of affairs in your organization? Because while all these solutions I'm going to describe have merit and will be effective, the key is, are they aligned with the current status of how these are working now? And everyone on this webinar is at a different stage and how succession planning and all these components are working in their organization. So to simply come in and say, here's a boilerplate, let's slap it in, then success is random. And I know no one on this webinar wants to be randomly successful. You want to be successful on purpose. So what we do is we come in, we meet with key stakeholders, department directors, hiring managers, sometimes elected officials, people that have been hired within the last year, some of your top performers. Get a lot of good information through focus groups and group interviews. And we look at how well are your attraction and recruitment processes working? How are you sourcing candidates? How well is that working? How timely is the recruitment process? Do you have a metric? What's the caliber of the applicant pools? What are the things we do with people that have been hired within the last year? We ask them, how was the hiring process? Who stayed in touch with you? What did you think about it? What were the interviews like? And we can appreciate that sometimes the hiring process in the public sector is not as prompt as it could be. The challenge is that you may be, and nothing is more frustrating to someone getting ready in the process of making a hiring decision than to reach out to their top candidate and the candidate's already taken a job with another agency. And I can appreciate sometimes that happens. It's just, bad luck. If that happens frequently where you're missing out on some of your top candidates, some of that has to do with how timely that process is to hiring. And that's not simply on HR. If those applications or resume sits on a hiring manager's desk for 2 months and they expect that when they pass them over to HR the next day that the interviews are set up and they can make a hiring decision within a week, I think that's unrealistic. So we look at those, and also how they're sourcing candidates. And while many of you are probably members of the state chapter of the transit agencies or maybe regional, and you post openings there or other outlets, sometimes that's too passive. So I'm going to give you some suggestions about how you can be more targeted with that. The selection and placement, as I just said, what's the process that you're using to make those hiring decisions? Nothing more disappointing than making a bad hiring decision. And please feel free to raise your hand if you've made a bad hiring decision. Yeah, and you realize I can't see you. So I'm sure some people raise their hand anyway. And if that bad hire's in the room with you, please don't look at them. But we've all made those decisions, and nothing is, and we have to remember in the public sector, when you hire a public sector employee, you've just married them. And trying to get divorced from them is extremely time-consuming and problematic. So selection and placement, we look at how that's working. And we also look at learning and development. Notice I did not put training on there. And what I encourage you to do when you go back to the workplace this afternoon, on your line item for your budget, I know this sounds really small, but sometimes the biggest dividends occur from the smallest changes. I encourage you on that line item on your budget to cross out the word training and replace it with the word learning, because training is an expense and learning is an investment. I think when you start to use learning, it changes the conversation within your organization with employees, with governing body members. It just is a game changer by simply using that word. And so learning, we look at how, and most public sector agencies, and you may be in this company, most of them do a good job of keeping people technically certified. In some respects, you have to, because they got to keep their certifications up in order to even do their job and to keep your organization, with their accreditation, if you will, if you have that. Where our organizations often struggle is, equipping people with what's called the soft skills. And I think we need to retire that term of soft skills, because soft sounds squishy and it sounds irrelevant. And what I have found, and maybe some of you have found this too, the soft skills are the hardest skills. people skills, dealing with coworkers, dealing with employees. Those people skills are typically the hardest ones. So learning and development, how well is that working in your agency to make sure that you're equipping people? And we know that typically when budgets get tight, often training is the first casualty, and then we wonder why the organization sometimes suffers. So when you start to put that together, and I know that can be a difficult discussion to have with governing body members, because sometimes, pardon me, I'm fighting my allergies. Sometimes they see training as optional. So I think if you put, I believe if you put learning in there, it does start to change the conversation. Then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we look at the performance appraisal system. How credible is that? How relevant is that? And then we look at career development, not just the ladders and steps, but how are people learning and growing? Within that, we also look at the promotional practices. One of the probably the most hidden aspects of succession planning that I think is indicative of an organization's focus is what gets promoted in an agency. And almost, time and time again, what I find is seniority gets promoted, even though people often say performance. But there is that, again, that myth that seniority translates to competence. What I would offer to you is that what we're finding with millennials in particular is they don't want to wait 8 years, pay their dues, and wait their turn to get promoted. And candidly, you can't wait for them to. Part of succession planning is to accelerate their learning and growth so they're more qualified sooner, faster. Think of that. You're trying to equip your workforce sooner, faster. And that's kind of a bumper sticker description of succession planning. So here are the 5 phases. We're going to spend the balance of this session examining each of these phases, as well as, I'm not sure what happened to that slide. That's got animation on it, Chris. I don't know if you can fix that slide there. It's not showing.
This one right here you're talking?
Yeah, on that 5-phase approach, slide 12, there's a diagram.
I'm not seeing in the original one that I have, so it didn't come over.
Oh, well, okay. For sake of, I apologize to that audience. I'm not sure what happened, but the first phase, and I apologize. We'll make sure in the PowerPoint slides that you receive as a result of this, that you receive the slides with the actual 5 steps. I'll share with you each one if you want to write it down, just for the sake of us moving along. And they're short descriptions, but we'll make sure in the PowerPoint slide you receive that it has the 5 phases, the diagram there with all the pretty colors. The first step, and let me share with you each of the 5, so if you want to write these down, I'll go slow. Then we're going to go through each of the phases. The step 1, so you want to do succession planning. You've gone to the webinar. You've read the articles. And by the way, you visit our website, Getting Better All the Time, and click on articles. And I've written extensively on succession planning, talent management, learning development. Feel free to download those articles. And now you say, we've talked about the what. Let's get into the mechanics. Let's get into the how. First step is to establish a task force. And again, I'm not going to go through each of these. Oh, someone said it is here and we can see it. Chris, Robin from Helena said that the diagram is there and they can see it.
Yeah, we are seeing a diagram with 5 steps on it, and there's multiple colors.
Okay. Apparently it's not showing up on mine, so I'm not sure why. So let's just strike what I just said. I apologize, everyone. Sometimes there's a little lag here. Must be the heat in Arizona slowing down the bandwidth. So we're going to go through each of these 5 steps. The 1 is to establish the task force. 2 is to identify the critical positions. 3 is to develop and retain that talent. 4 is to adopt a knowledge transfer management program. And 5 is to measure, monitor, and evaluate. The first one is to establish the task force. When I mentioned earlier that if succession planning is viewed simply as another HR initiative, I just think it's going to struggle to be a high priority. What I have done with organizations, and they have found this to be by and large very successful, is to assemble a task force of key stakeholders in your agency that can shepherd this into the organization. Notice I call it a task force and not a committee. Committees go on in perpetuity. Task forces have an end date. So the implication here is that when you establish a task force, at some point they finish. It may be a year or 2 down the road, but they're the ones that oversee the adoption, the implementation of succession planning. They secure funding. They're the ones that are advisors to executive leaders. And the task force, I would offer you, should not be simply a subset of department directors. I encourage you to consider people in the organization out and about in the ranks, people that are influential, people that other employees are going to pay attention to. Because one of the backdrops of doing succession planning that I have seen time and time again in the clients I work with is it's a change initiative. And we know people in the public sector love change. Right, they often struggle with it. So when we think that succession planning, simply by the merit of the idea, is going to somehow be well received and people are going to applaud, I think we have to really reconsider that this is competing for time and attention. There are some people out in the organization that wish it would just go away. They're not sure how it's going to work. They don't know if they're going to benefit. Lots of reasons to sort of, talk to the hand as a way to passively, if not aggressively, refute it and dismiss it. So when you look at the succession planning as a change initiative, I really use, and I recommend here in this 5-phase approach, that you need to have these steps that are relevant to successful change in the organization as part of succession planning. That first one is the task force. They're going to raise the temperature in the organization about succession planning, the why, and what you need to be doing about it. They're a visible advocate in the organization, so it doesn't just sort of go away, and it's not something that HR does when it gets around to it. It's not simply the top administrator for him or her to do it when they have time, because there's always a competition for their time and attention. So let me ask you to take a few minutes. And I know some of you are in this webinar with other people from your agency. And if you're not, if you're by yourself on this, you can still do this. But I ask you to take a minute and identify who are the names of the persons who you think should comprise your task force. Have a conversation right now. And I know this gets into, you're sort of calling people out to say who should be on our task force. But I really encourage you to think about it. And there's no magic number, I would encourage you, make sure that it's not unwielding. 10 minutes or 10 people or 15 people. I'd keep it, 6 or 7 people, key stakeholders in the organization that people are going to listen to. They're credible. They're driving change in the organization. I encourage you when you assemble this task force, and I'm sure I'm talking over some of you, so let me just say this and I'll stop so you can discuss it within your group. I wouldn't have a chairperson, a vice, and gosh, don't have anybody take minutes because nobody's going to read them. But keep this as a kind of a group of equals, and I think that helps propel the group to be effective. So I'm going to stop talking to you for a minute or two. You think about those names. I encourage you, if you're by yourself, still jot some names down. So your audio has not gone sour. It's just that I'm letting people discuss this in real time. Some names of people in their organization they believe would be good members, relevant, credible members of the task force. Okay. And I would encourage you to continue this conversation. There's going to be other questions I'm going to be asking you. This is a kind of a teaser, but I encourage you to continue these questions after we wrap up today. The next bullet point, the next phase in the approach is to identify the critical positions. The issue around succession planning is it's not one size fits all. It's not peanut butter. You cover everybody with one spread of the knife over to the entire organization. What you're trying to do is make sure that your succession planning efforts are targeted at what are considered the most critical positions. So let me ask, here's another polling question. When was the most recent time an analysis has been completed of your workforce demographics? And Chris is going to help us on this. Within the last 6 months, within the last year, or not sure it's ever been done. And everyone can see.
Patrick, we lost your voice, so if you could please go ahead and click Start Broadcasting again. There you go.
I'm back. Sorry about that. I got kicked off. Apologize for that.
Okay, we have about half of the people responding.
Okay. Give people another 15 seconds. And what are workforce demographics, as you considering, some of you may be saying, what is that? Within your organization's HR information systems, and I know some of that can be really rudimentary. It may be on an Excel spreadsheet or something, but the question here is, and without necessarily identifying names, when's the last time you looked at your demographics by job title, by age, by tenure? And really, because this is somewhat what succession planning is, and what I'm encouraging you to do this for is, it's beyond the anecdotal. You really need to start looking at the empirical data and looking at your workforce, because from that analysis, you can start to identify what positions within your agency should deserve the most attention sooner around succession planning. So we can wrap that up, Chris. Let me share with all of you. Here are 7 different, I'm sorry, I'll click forward. Sorry about that. Here are 7 different components, and I'm going to ask you to look at this. As you look at your workforce, start to identify names. This is a little bit more detailed, but when there are 7 different components as you look at your workforce. So you've run the data, you've got it in a spreadsheet, you've got some pretty pie charts. Now I'm encouraging you to really go back and look at your data several different times. One, when you start to look at that data, which of those positions is there a single incumbent? So the key here is don't get lost in just large numbers. And by the way, pardon me, if you're measuring turnover, I encourage you to revisit that. And instead of measuring simply turnover, measure regrettable turnover, people that have left that you would prefer to keep. Measure, if it's high turnover is not a bad thing and low turnover is not necessarily a good thing. We need to get way past that notion. So look at your workforce demographics. Some of you have people, single incumbent, and that person's about to retire, and you may not have a natural successor. The second component, these are not in priority order, by the way. Look at your workforce through the lens of critical task. You probably have some employees, some positions where they're doing things that are mission critical, not easy to replace, and they possess a tremendous amount of knowledge that when they walk, a lot of that knowledge goes with them. And I'll share with you a little bit in the 4th phase about knowledge transfer. The 3rd one, and some of these are overlap. Which positions, which employees have specialized knowledge and expertise? So if they leave, again, not just simply retire, but maybe you've had high turnover in a certain position, that's a position that you want to target your succession planning efforts, maybe about attraction and selection as well as promotion. The 4th one is those positions that are difficult to replace from inside or outside of the organization. Again, I hope that you're starting to see as you piece these together that when you come out on the other side of succession planning to have those gap closing strategies, it's not just one size fits all. You're really trying to target dimensions in your workforce. So one of the takeaways I want you to have from today's webinar as you look at succession planning is understand your workforce is a series of demographics. It's not just this, and I know you all know this, but I'm really trying to emphasize that you have different demographics in your organization, not simply by age and by tenure, but also by capability, by talent, by education, by experience, different demographics within your organization. The 5th one, difficult to retain. Maybe you have some positions of high turnover. Now, as Del said in his remarks in some of the survey, and I agree with this, he talked about how you may have subcontractors, or you may have people that are contract employees. One of the things I encourage clients to do is if you have certain positions that are really difficult to not only hire but keep, maybe that's not necessarily a good investment of your organization's time to continually spend time hiring employees in positions that are high turnover. Because I would offer to you, money is not your agency's most precious resource. Time is. And so if people are spending time simply replacing positions that are constantly in high turnover, and you can increase the compensation, that doesn't necessarily change the tenure of people in those positions. I encourage clients, pardon me. I encourage clients to look at their workforce not simply as everybody needs to be an FTE, a full-time equivalent, or even part-time, but maybe it's a function that we need to decide as an organization to get out of. Maybe we do need to contract that out. And I'm not saying that's always the case. But again, if you've got positions that are high turnover, maybe it's time that you decide partnering, outsourcing that, sharing it with another agency. So again, difficult to retain. The 6th one is risk of attrition. Maybe you have a lot of people in a certain job title that are all kind of compressed, clustered together, close to retirement age, and maybe those are some of your operators or drivers or something. And so you're going to have high turnover of those positions in short order. How do you make sure, and again, target your resources with attraction and retention, learning, development, to backfill those and get that bench ready sooner, faster. And then same with number 7, retirement vulnerable. Risk of attrition, retirement vulnerable sometimes are the same. What I'm going to do is, again, take a few minutes. This is an exercise I'd like for you to do to start to identify positions, if not people's names, and you can use it wherever you have right there in your room, in your office, your conference room. Start to put some names down, and I encourage you after today to go back and look at your workforce using these 7 different criteria to really start to identify which positions in your organization really should be the recipient of resources you're targeting for succession planning. So let's take a few minutes, start putting some names and job titles to that. And again, you're going to be able to do this subsequent to this morning as well. No, I'm still here. I'm just asking the people to, as someone posted, we lost sound, is their problem? No, I was just providing people some time in right now to look at their workforce through slide 16, the exercise of evaluating their workforce against this different criteria. And again, we're not going to be able to complete this morning, but again, we're trying to provide, think of today's session as sort of an appetizer, a sampler platter, if you will, about succession planning. And I'm trying to equip you and expose you with some, expose you to some practical solutions about how to move off from the idea to application. So you've got the task force in place, credible group of key stakeholders that are going to drive this in the organization. You've generated the data. You started to look at the workforce. You've got all these different pie charts and graphs and charts. You've looked at it through this criteria. Remember, so you've got the people in place that can help drive this. You've got the exercises done for the workforce. You're providing the workforce demographic analysis to this task force. They're looking at the data. They start to pare it down. They're applying some critical thinking to say, okay, as we start to look at the organization, you would also provide them with, and I've done this for clients, the assessment, the assessment of those succession planning practices that I shared in an earlier slide about what's the baseline of our organization. So they have some good data from, that was on slide 10. They have some good information. They're in place. They have a commitment to this. They're in there for the right reasons. Now they start to put together, and I've worked with a number of clients helping them on this slide. The third phase, develop and retain their talent. Now this is probably the sexiest step. This is where people often want to jump in. They just want to, let's get right to closing the gaps. The question is, how big are your gaps? But the second thing is, again, pardon me, I'm handling a cough here for my allergies. I apologize. The question here is, which ones will work for you? Let me ask another polling question, a couple of polling questions, and then we're going to get into some dimensions that actually, how do you develop and retain your talent? So Chris, if you'd help me on this next one. How well are we using, you using social media channels to announce job openings? Think Facebook and LinkedIn. And the polling question, very well, okay, but it's hit and miss, not at all. Good response there. About 22% say very well, 55% say okay, but it's hit and miss, and not at all, about 27%. We'll give people about another 10 seconds to respond. I would offer to you, LinkedIn is becoming probably the most prominent outlet to really source candidates. Remembering, and I would encourage you, everyone on this, even if you're not actively looking for work, I encourage you to have a profile on LinkedIn. I post something about every other day about leadership or change or innovation or workforce. And I just posted something this morning about an article I wrote for ICMA on how to accelerate your growth, some things that we're talking about this morning. But LinkedIn has tremendous opportunities for your agency, not simply for you to post job openings, but they are becoming sort of an aggregator. They're out there posting about announcing job openings. The other, and we can close this, Chris, the other component about social media is, and this is probably the more challenging one, is 80% of job seekers are finding their job openings via a mobile app. So, I really encourage you, do not ask your IT department to develop a mobile app for job announcements. That's like asking IT to update your website. We have to remember, and I love and affection for IT people, but that's not their core skill. Your website is a communication device, and your mobile app is a marketing device. Something to think about with social media, especially around attraction, is it's a term called social marketing through Facebook and LinkedIn. It's really about you and articulating your employer brand. Now, a brand is not a logo. It's the reputation you have as an employer. I do a whole session on employer branding. It's a whole lot more than a new logo. But social media helps you carry your message out about what kind of experience am I going to have if I work for your agency? How timely is the hiring process? What kind of opportunities am I going to have when I learn and grow? And so think about Facebook and LinkedIn being some great, wonderful resources to do outreach, to communicate your brand, your message as an employer. One of the challenges I find is government often defines itself as an institution. I think it needs to define itself as an employer. When you define yourself as an employer, you realize you're competing for talent. I think that's a bit of a game changer, and you start revisiting and refreshing your approach about how you're building your workforce. Social media, so if you're not on social media posting job announcements and doing it frequently with a really strong message, I'm sorry to tell you, you're really not in the game for top talented people. You can't just post on your website or your state chapter and expect people to find you. The days of that happening, as we all know, business as usual to post and pray are over. It's a lot more, it's a different world. Here's another polling question. How satisfied are you with your current learning and training programs for non-technical skills? Think of these are the people skills. So Chris, if you'd help me on this. How well are you satisfied with your current learning and training programs for non-technical skills? Very satisfied, satisfied, dissatisfied are the three options. About half, a little over half are satisfied. That's good. 20% are dissatisfied. And again, think of these are people skills. So that's good that you're investing time and resources to equip your workforce with those skill sets, that people that are essential really to people's growth and effectiveness. About another 10 seconds, Chris, and then we can close this. Then I'm going to provide the group another exercise. Okay. So about 62% of people are satisfied. And before you get into this exercise, let me just share with you that these sort of imply, this exercise sort of implies what I would recommend with your gap closing strategy. So step 3, develop and retain your talent. That's when you identify and implement your gap closing strategy to transition from the workforce you have to the workforce you need. How do you do that? Here are some different things that you can do. One, as I said about social media, to use that extensively and frequently to promote your message as an employer. Something else to consider is the application process. Many times the application process in the public sector is protracted, and it's people are not going to spend 2 or 3 hours filling out an application and a questionnaire simply to apply for a job. Something to think about is really revisiting that, and this is going to be radical, but I really encourage you to revisit to where I can apply for a job in your agency by my phone. I should be able to apply, create a profile on my phone, and I should be able to create a profile in your agency. If you don't have an applicant tracking system in your agency, again, you're not even in the game. People do not want to spend all day. Number one, people don't want to print out a PDF, fill something out, and then mail it back to you. You really need to have an online applicant tracking system for people to fill out. At the same time, it should be an experience that is not painful and protracted and I get kicked off the system or I can't save my information. I'm down in the weeds now, but these are some of the turnoffs when you think of what's the candidate experience like. So think of those candidates. What's the experience they're having applying for a job? I think every organization should have a time to hire metric that's visible as a measure throughout the organization. People should know that time to hire measure. Just an old practice I used to have when I was in city management. Anytime we got positions approved, we made sure all those positions were filled before we went back to our city council to ask for new positions. because I knew the first question I'd hear from a council member would be, well, I thought you needed those positions so bad you'd already have them filled. So we were trying to beat him to the punch, and so we could say, we've already filled those positions. So really accelerating your hiring process, not just for the political aspect, but also that knowing that you're competing for talent, keeping that process moving along. The job announcements. Please do a favor for me, do a favor for your agency. Never again make a job description a job announcement. They're boring. A job description is very task-centric. I would encourage you to think about putting a little bit more sizzle in your marketing message about jobs in your organization. First thing that a realtor tells you when you want to sell your house is you need to have curb appeal. I'd ask all of you at this afternoon to go to your website, see how long it takes you to find job announcements. By the way, I think every department should have on their homepage jobs in their organization, and it should be on one click on your homepage. There should be testimonials from employees about what it means to work there. It should be an easy-to-apply process. But if I'm reading a job description, they're very task-centric. I would ask you to consider, do people in your agency have a job or do they have a role? They probably have both, but you're probably looking more for people that understand they have a role. Your interviewing process. I encourage organizations to adopt behavioral interviewing, which is asking people not what-if questions, because then they game the interview. Like, are you a hard worker? What are people going to say? No, hire me, I'll be your worst nightmare. People are going to say yes. Asking people, describe for me an experience that you've had in your last position wherein you were dealing with conflict between two employees. What did you do? Now, again, some people know how to game those responses, but behavioral interviewing is all about what did you do, not what would you do. How are you handling the training? And again, I should cross that word out and put in the word learning. I got to catch it myself. How are you making sure that you're providing, not just for leaders or managers, but how about that next rung of employees that are maybe foremen or superintendents or maybe just a rung below that? How are you providing resources for them to learn and grow? And without pre-selecting, how do you provide those resources for maybe a supervisory development program? And if you're in a smaller agency, I've seen this happen time and time again. You know, if you're a transit agency in a rural part of the community, I encourage you to a rural part of a county or something. I encourage you, and you're probably already doing this, partner with the county, partner with maybe a village or a town or a township, and because then, and I've done this for clients, they pool everybody together, and everybody in the room is a public sector employee. So therein, you have a lot in common. While the color of your collar may be slightly different, you're not in the room with private sector people where people are getting training about widgets or market share or profitability. Everybody's in the room is a public sector employee, so they're in the same dimension of providing a service to a taxpayer, a resident, a customer, those. Again, that performance appraisal process. We talked about that. And then the career development. So I went into a little bit of detail here. You can see these are where the gap closing strategies are identified and then they're implemented. I would ask you to, within your group or by yourself, respond to these questions. You know, what is that caliber of applicant pools? And remember, I would encourage you, don't measure the success of an application process by the size of the pool. It still comes down to 3 or 4 people. And then just go to the sources you're using to attract candidates and the job announcements and how are some improvements. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to do that. Again, this should be top of mind, what you're seeing, what you're experiencing. So I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes and give you a chance in your group or by yourself to respond to those questions. Again, I'm still here. You haven't lost sound. I'm still here. Okay. I'm sure, hopefully you're in the throes of a really healthy discussion around some improvements you can make. And one of the services I provide for clients besides all 5 of these phases in particular to this phase, this is where I provide them some, and I'm not about best practices, I'm about next practices or proven practices. I provide them some really good practices that I have seen in other public as well as private and nonprofit sector agencies about how they're building their workforce. There's a lot of excellent information out there. I would encourage you, and I hope that you're not limiting yourself regarding the proven practices in building your workforce simply to other transit agencies. I would encourage you to broaden, kind of widen the net and look at other public sector agencies, whether they're smaller or larger. I wouldn't focus on that. I would focus on what is it that you can learn from other agencies that will help you build your workforce, because in some respects you're all in the same bus, so to speak, not the boat, but the same bus in regards to building your workforce. All right, the next phase, this is again the sexy side. You adopt these programs, you implement them. These are targeted. Again, in these positions, notice this is also not just about hiring. There should also be included in here about your promotional practices as well as your current workforce, how you're equipping them with skill sets, learning and development activities, how you're using performance. This is the meat on the bone, if you will, of succession planning. This is where the lion's share of time and effort and resources are spent on these components, phase 3. You're putting them in place. In tandem with this is another emerging component. On August 23rd, LinkedIn is sponsoring me to present a webinar on knowledge transfer. So you may mark that down, August 23rd. We have not posted it yet. August 23rd, I think around noon Central Time, maybe 1 Central Time. I'll be doing a 45-minute webinar on knowledge transfer. I did one on succession planning on May 24th by LinkedIn. Knowledge transfer is one of those components that is receiving more and more attention. I've worked with several agencies helping them implement knowledge transfer. Think of knowledge transfer as how do you repurpose the tacit knowledge of employees before they leave? How do you repurpose the tacit knowledge? Notice I didn't say everything, because the fact is you're not going to be able to capture what everybody asking people to write down, everything they know before they leave, because then people sit down and start off with long, long ago in a galaxy far away. I mean, that's not practical. I think we did that. People did that years ago, and it didn't work. So knowledge transfers, the tacit knowledge, how you do business, and you have different ways of doing business, maybe different demographics, different positions, different cultures, different work sites. There's all different ways of how people are getting work done. And when people leave, you can replace credentials, you can replace experience, you can replace expertise. What's the most difficult thing to replace is tacit knowledge. And so here are 8 different, let me ask this. When you think about knowledge transfer in your organization, and beyond just policies, procedures, rules, and regulations, I think that's a minimum. How pleased or how satisfied are you with your current efforts at knowledge transfer? How you're really repurposing that tacit knowledge before people are leaving? Notice the options are very good, a mixed bag, non-existent. Large majority are in that a mixed bag. Yeah, and that's what I find with my clients is people are doing it. The challenge is it's not replicable. Some people do it, some people don't. Some people that like to do it will do it. Some people are knowledge hoarders. So the last thing they're going to do is share knowledge because they think that's the way they make themselves indispensable. About another 10 seconds, Chris, and then we can wrap up on that slide. What I have found in my experience for strategies, on my website, Getting Better All the Time, under articles and papers, if you scroll down, there's an article on the website's about to get a major reboot, so it is a little dated, but that link is still active. There's an article, Transfer Knowledge Before It's Too Late. I really encourage you to download that. It's about a 4-page article, PDF, very practical, strong concept, healthy application, and I describe each of these dimensions in detail because, again, there are scores of knowledge transfer strategies. What I found in organizations is they want to know which ones work for us. And the fact is, not all of these strategies, and I'm going to go through these briefly, will necessarily work for every position. And again, as I said earlier, when you look at your workforce, think demographics, not let's do the one thing for everybody. So going clockwise here, and again, there's more information in that article. You can download that, and it'll supplement what I'm sharing now. Expert interviews. The expert would be the incumbent. So I've worked with agencies where you actually interview the incumbent on that tacit knowledge. We actually record. Sometimes I videotape people, especially a lot of top executives. We videotape them, not cold. We work on a script of questions. They rehearse a little bit. We videotape them. those of you that are on this call, think about if you'd had a chance to watch your predecessor on video describing relationships and workplace culture and leadership issues and issues with your governing body or challenges with the organization or dealing with the feds or the state aid, whatever. That video you could go back and play time and time again. So a good way to transfer knowledge is video or the written for other positions. We actually capture the highlights of people's job, and everyone does have a highlight reel to their job. And we capture that in writing, and that's provided for both hiring processes of their successor as well as their successor. Another one, and I'm sure many of you are using this, apprenticeship and trainee programs. Very common in field environments where they have an apprenticeship and trainee program. That's another knowledge transfer strategy. Interns can be. Community of practice is really starting to gather attention here, and I failed to, and I'm sorry I did not put that on here. I add another one here about knowledge transfer strategy. I just finished an article on this morning for ICMA about mentoring. ICMA is the International City County Management Association. Some of you may be members of that. It also includes, executives from other government agencies, including transit. Community of practice is like a group mentoring. So it's how people are, that's happening right now out in the field with your workers. Community of practice is an intentional group mentoring program. Storytelling is also sort of group mentoring. Retire to rehire, some of you may have that process in place where people leave and they come back. Just so you know, the takeaway, the response that many of your younger employees look at the retire to rehire is, when are these people finally going to leave? And I've heard that from younger people time and time again. I thought I was going to have a shot at getting promoted, but this 58-year-old or 61-year-old retired on Friday, came back Monday, and still has the same job. Believe me, that is a deterrent to your younger employees who think they were going to at least have a shot. Now, again, I encourage you, if you're going to have retire to rehire, make sure that the condition of them coming back is they're going to share their knowledge. If they're not willing to share their knowledge, I don't think you should bring them back, because that's part of knowledge transfer, is making sure that people are doing it intentionally. It's hard to mandate. Some people always find time to do things other than help other people, and I know that's challenging. Linda posted a question, could you provide the reference document reference for knowledge transfer strategies? Linda, I'll talk with Joe and see if we can somehow bundle that together with the PowerPoint, okay? So that way you don't have to go to the site, though I encourage you to learn more about that, but we'll see what we can do. Job aids, I'm sure many of you have that. Think of that just pictures, job aids within a fleet, at the job site, maybe at your maintenance center. That's also a knowledge transfer strategy. On-the-job training, OJT, I'm sure many of you have those in place. And I know maybe you didn't realize these were knowledge transfer strategies, but these are all part of how you're essentially repurposing that tacit knowledge to other employees so there's not a disruption in your ability to deliver services. So knowledge transfer is not just for posterity, like you're archiving historical information. I have seen organizations do that. No one ever goes to that. It has little to no value except for historical purposes. This is about actual, practical, tactical information people need in order to do their work and for there not to be a hiccup. Because this gets back to risk management, a risk management strategy, succession planning, knowledge transfer. It's to mitigate the likelihood you're going to have a disruption in service because of the departure of people. And the final one here, and these are not in priority order, this is sort of just a potpourri, if you will, approach of a Wikipedia. Some of you may have a wiki. The key to having an internal wiki is to make sure that it stays current and people use it. If people are not keeping it current and relevant, people won't use it. So again, knowledge transfer is a subset of succession planning. I identified it as the fourth step. It can go in tandem with step 3. I'm working right now with a client in San Francisco area water district, we just put together a knowledge transfer program for them, and we're about to implement it. It is a different animal than just simply doing succession planning. There's some overlap. What most organizations are doing, like some of you that responded to the polling question, people are doing it, and what I find with clients is same with succession planning. Everybody on this webinar is doing it. It's just not synchronized. It's not integrated. It's not replicable. So it's a little like making spaghetti. You throw this up on the wall, you throw that up on the wall, you see what sticks. The mission critical aspect of this is you want to make sure the succession planning and knowledge transfer are embedded in place in the organization. They're replicated, they're effective, they're applied, they're visible, they're successful, all those wonderful things. What I offer to my clients is after we start, within 2 or 3 years, they're not doing succession planning and knowledge transfer anymore. And they sort of look at me quizzically and they go, well, what? I said, because it becomes the way you do business. And we all on this webinar can appreciate embedding new practices into the public sector can be challenging. However, once they've penetrated that DNA and it becomes how you do business, then people can't really take them out. It's not a budget line item that goes, well, we're tight on money, so we can't do this anymore. However, penetrating that culture and the work environment and making this not where it's optional, but embedding this, that's really the key, because then it's replicated and it's self-replenishing. So the final phase of all this, so you've got all these things in place. The task force is there. They're overseeing it. They've looked at the workforce demographics. They've identified those mission-critical key positions. They put these solutions in place to target those positions both internally as well as recruitment. Now it's the fifth step. Now you need to make sure that you're capturing some data and reporting that out regularly. And here are some metrics that you can use. And I think these are very practical. These are all quantifiable. Now, I would venture to say that many of you are on this webinar not simply because you looked at the data, but you just have a gut feeling like, we know this is happening, and we know people are leaving. We hear a lot about the succession planning, the retirement tsunami, and we just don't feel good in our gut. So this signing up for this webinar is going to help us maybe maneuver through what the issues are, help us get on the other side with at least a planned approach, and that's what I and Dell try to provide you, is the data and then the approach. And so I would encourage you, as you look to measure and have metrics, please include in your metrics, and these are all quantifiable, and I'm not going to go through all these, you can see them, and I would report these out to your governing body, to your workforce. This is the role of your task force. Do this maybe quarterly or every 6 months or once a year, but do it regularly and report it out. Don't just let that task force keep that in-house. The challenge I see is once they start succession planning, people think, well, didn't we do that already? Like, you're done. You're never really done. As I said in my opening remarks, succession planning is a process, not an event. But as I was saying, keep in mind that part of your metric is more qualitative. Hey, it's been 3 months. We've got the task force in place. We've looked at the workforce demographics. We're starting to roll things out. I just feel better. I feel better as an executive. I feel better as a mid-manager. I think that's relevant to say. I think one of the things that we have to be careful of in the public sector is falling in love with metrics. Government tends to measure things that it can't. It just doesn't always measure things that matter. And I'm not trying to be glib about that, but keep in mind to share with the governing body employees, look, we now have a planned approach. We're feeling better that what we're putting in place about succession planning is by design. We feel better that the approach we have is moving us in the right direction, and we have some hard data to support it. So include in your metrics some qualitative data, the interpretation, your judgment, your perspective, your feel for the whole situation. So, final polling question here, the $1 million question. How likely are you now to pursue a succession planning program? Very likely, after what Dell and I provided for you, you feel better that you have some new tools in place, some resources, some information, you're armed with it. I know people want to walk away these webinars like it's just add water, but it's more complicated than that. And it's great to see this is a strong response of very likely, over half the group. Somewhat likely is right, it's neck and neck. They're neck and neck here. I hope that, and it's great that there's, just looks like nobody has responded, maybe one, on unlikely. And I know Dell is delighted. We're delighted that you have found this webinar helpful for you to immerse yourself in the topic, to look at the data and that wonderful research that Dell shared, very relevant, to hear what I was sharing with you on the approach about succession planning and the whys and the whats and the how-tos. We can wrap that up. And let me just wrap up here on a slide about my firm. And Joe has been gracious enough to provide me the opportunity to share a little bit of marketing information. We're a change in organizational effectiveness consulting practice, and we partner with organizations to implement solutions. Hopefully you found from my remarks today that I have a deep amount of expertise and experience in succession planning and talent management. We work a lot with organizations nationwide and organizational effectiveness services as well, OD in short. We do a lot of strategic planning, leadership, and management. I've been in succession planning for over a decade. So what I bring, I was in it before it was in vogue. I was in it while it was kind of on the back seat, and I'm definitely in it right now when it's coming back in full force. I would be delighted at some point to work with you and discuss with your agency about how I can be a partner. My final comment, and Mejorando is Spanish for getting better all the time. I really appreciate the opportunity for you to take time out of your schedule to participate in this webinar. I do very much hope that my remarks on succession planning help you get better all the time. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass it back to Joe at this point as we wrap up.
Thank you, Patrick and Dell. And again, on behalf of the West Region Transportation Workforce Center and the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute, who sponsored this webinar today, we would like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us, and we hope you found this very useful. Again, we will be posting both presentations. We'll make those available. We'll send out a link, and this also was recorded today. We will have that available sometime next week, and we will be in contact with you. Before you sign off today, please take the evaluation of this session, which should be popping up here momentarily. I think Chris is going to do that for us. So please take just a couple more minutes and fill out that application. And again, our very heartfelt thanks to both Dell and Patrick. With that, I encourage you to ask any final questions and share your thoughts with us via the evaluation form. Thank you.